to show you some watercolor techniques. There are a few things you need to start with. The first is watercolor, so you're going to need a pan of watercolor. You will need a pencil. You will need a crayon of any color. You will also need a small cup of water. You don't need much water. You will also need a small amount of salt, a piece of watercolor paper, and then you will need a paper towel. You will need 2 pieces of paper towel. You don't need much paper towel, so you can just take 1 piece and tear it in half. But those are all the supplies you will need in order to start this tutorial. So I'm going to be showing you 6 different types of watercolor techniques. I'll be showing you wet on dry, wet on wet, lifting, which is really great for making clouds, salt, which is great for making texture. We'll do wax resist using a crayon, and we'll also be doing layering. So at the end, you should make a product sample that looks kind of similar to this. You can use different colors as we go along and do different design and mark makings, but in the end, you'll have a sheet that will show 6 different techniques of watercolor. Okay, so the first thing you want to do is write your name and your class on the back. And then flip your paper over. Now we're going to divide our paper into 6 different sections. These do not need to be even sections. You do not need to use a ruler for this. We're just going to draw 6 different sections. Like so. So next we're going to label each section. So the first one we're going to do is wet on dry. Just label it at the bottom of your paper. And then we're going to do wet on wet. Then we're going to do lifting, salt, resist, and layering. So before we get started, just a few little tips on watercolor. So we are using pan watercolors, so these are pigments that are dried in these pans. So that is why we need water. When you're using the water, dip your paintbrush in the water, but do not tap off or wipe off the excess. This is watercolor, so it's 1 part water to 1 part color. So when you're dipping your brush in, leave it. Do not tap it off or wipe it on the side. You want the water in your bristles of your brush. When you go to use your paint, you need to wake up the color. So you can pick 1 color to start with, and what you're going to do is just use that water that is on your brush and rub it around into that pan to wake up the color. That way you will have water with the color to actually make the paint. So we are actually going to start with the very last section, which is called layering, just because this needs to dry before we can add the additional layer. So you can pick any color of paint, wake it up just like I showed you, and then we are just going to put a layer of paint just right down in that section. You don't need to fill the entire section, but do a large area and just spread it up and down. Again, don't rub, you don't need to make a hole in your paper, just nicely spread it up and down. And then we're just going to leave that to dry, and then we are going to skip ahead to the very beginning and start wet on dry. Wet and dry applies that the paint is wet and the paper is dry. So we are going to wake up, you can use a different color if you'd like, we are going to wake up any color of paint. And then I am going to apply this paint to the dry paper. What this is allowing me to do is give me more control. The paint is only going to go where my paintbrush goes. It's not going to spread out. So this is great if you want to do fine detail, any line, shape, or design work. And when you're using just the tip of your brush, you can get really thin lines. If you want to do any lettering with this, this is also great. So next we are going to move on to wet on wet. So this means that the paper is wet as well as the paint. So you are going to take your paintbrush, which is your regular plain water, and you are going to paint a section of your paper. So it should look clear. Just get it wet. Then I'm going to take any color of my paints and I will wake it up. And then I'm going to apply this paint directly to the wet area. Now this creates some blooms if you like that kind of effect, but the paint only wants to go where that wet area is. It wants to stay in that area. If you are doing a larger area with this wet on wet technique, you need to work at small areas at a time, because if you do a large area that is wet, by the time you are able to paint it all, most likely the paint or the paper will be dry. So if you would like to do this technique on a large area, work in small sections. So moving on, we are going to do the lifting technique. Like I said earlier, this is really great for clouds. Also, if you make a mistake and you need to lift some of the paint off, this also works, but you have to do it while the paint is still wet. If you want to use it for a cloud effect, it's really great to do it with the wet and wet technique. So we are going to do what we did here, and we are going to wet the paper just with plain water. Then I'm going to wake up a color. I'm going to apply that color to the watered area I just created. And then you do have to kind of work kind of fast. You are going to take a small piece of paper towel and just kind of like bunch it up to create like a little point with the paper towel. And then you're going to use that and just press it down to your paper, and it will lift off the paint. And you can see how it's sturdy here. Just bunch up another tip and you can lift off some more. Again, if you're going to do this in a large area, you need to do small sections at a time, because like I said, the paint needs to be wet in order to do this lifting technique. So moving on to the salt technique, we again are going to start with the wet on wet technique. So I'm going to wet my paper with just plain water. Then I'm going to wake up a color. I'm going to apply that color to my wet area. Again, with this technique, you do have to work kind of fast. So while that is still wet, I'm going to take a very small pinch of just regular table salt, and I'm going to sprinkle that down onto my watercolor. Again, your watercolor has to be wet, so if you're going to do this in a large section, you need to do small sections at a time. And what this does is the salt repels the paint, so it kind of spreads out. So we are just going to let this dry. Don't try to take the salt off, just let it dry. As it starts to dry, you'll start to see the speckled effect. So we are going to let this dry, and then we're going to move on to our next one, which is the wax resist. So for the wax resist, you do need a crayon. You can use any color crayon, but you can use this for making designs. So wherever the crayon is, the watercolor will repel from that area, so you'll still be able to see the design. When you're using a wax crayon, you do need to press fairly hard. You can also use oil pastels. They work just as well. I'm going to use this white crayon, so you're not going to really be able to see what I'm doing right now, but I'm going to press pretty hard and make a few designs. You can also do lettering with this. Then I'm just going to simply take a watercolor, and I apply this watercolor straight over the crayon area. And then you can see the areas where I have applied the crayon. Like so. So moving on, we're going to go back to our layering area. If you notice, watercolor dries fairly fast, and when it dries, the watercolor dries lighter, so the colors appear lighter when they are dry. So if you want to make a color darker, what you can do is build up layers. This is also called glazing. So I did this light green area, and if I wanted to make it darker, this is already dry, I can just take that same light green and place it right over the dried paint and make it darker. And you can build up the color several times. Just letting it dry in between the layers is the major thing. So we have created wet on dry, wet on wet, lifting, salt, wax resist, and layering. Once all this is dry, you can take your finger and remove this salt over a trash can. And then once everything is dry, make sure your name and class is on the back, and then turn it